Jason. Okay, thank you all very much for coming out here on your lunchtime, for some of you I'm sure. And on account of that, I suspect some of you may only have an hour, so we're going to try and keep it within that confines. But happy St. Patrick's Day to you all, or St. Patrick's weekend to you all. So in that hour, I'm going to stir you around with a bit of a ramble. It could be experimental. You are today's guinea pigs to an extent of my talk about the Irish abroad and this strange title, Gunslingers, Tarantulas, Elvis and Walt. And one of the first things I learned when I was studying history was that you need to know a little bit about your historian first. So very quickly, I was born in County Carlow, born in Dublin, raised in County Carlow, educated in Dublin and then in Scotland. I then came back and studied law at Trinity, and I absolutely hated law at Trinity. I did 2 years of it, and I just had a big fallout with it, and I transferred and changed and started studying history instead, and suddenly I was home. I found my niche with Ireland in the age of the Vikings and the Tudors and all that, much better than equitable mortgages and torts and all that stuff I had been learning. So I then, after college, I became a travel writer, and I spent about 10 years being a travel writer. I lived in Hong Kong for a number of years, and I sort of headed primarily of Irishmen. And they were also deserters from the US Army. So I'm just going to give you very quick, this is the war story to begin with, ladies. We'll move on to other stuff in a little while. But basically, at that stage, none of this was the United States, basically, was this bit over here. In 1845, the Republic of Texas volunteered to join the United States. And it's still got a get-out clause, Texas has. It can actually pull out whenever it wants, and I'm quite surprised it hasn't over the last 10, 12 years. This is running along the Mexican border, and being a border, obviously there's constant disputes, because that's what happens. If you stick up a border, people are going to have disputes. And what happens is, in 1845, this fella, James Knox Polk, becomes the US president. That's a photograph from 1845, one of those daguerreotypes, one of the very first photographs. He is got Irish blood coursing through his veins, but of the Scots-Irish type. His family are from Coleraine in County Derry and moving around to Lifford in County Derry. Anyway, he's part of that big Scots-Irish mafioso who'd moved into Ireland into America during the 18th century. And he's had a look at this area, and he thinks, you know, these Mexicans, I don't think they're up to much. And one way or the other, he orchestrates a border war along here that ultimately gets him to get US Congress to give him 10 million quid, which is a huge amount, $10 million in those days, and 50,000 soldiers to go down and invade Mexico. It's the first time the US has ever invaded another country. So to arms, the banners appeared all over the north of America, and one of the people who sees it is John Riley, who's strolling through somewhere in Michigan when he sees it. He joins up. Next thing, he's posted right down to the Mexican border to start the invasion of Mexico. But after not very long, John Riley decides that he's not really into it, and he's going to change sides. And he's not alone. A lot of people do. Primarily, a lot of them are Irish, like the Irish guys I mentioned on this list here. We've got Patrick Dalton, Andrew Nolan, Patrick Casey, William O'Connor. There's huge numbers of Irish guys who are in the American army, and they all decide to change to the Mexican. And the reason that they do that is because the Mexicans offer them much better payment. They offer them 340 acres of land to any soldier who deserts, which is obviously Mexican land, but still. And they also have a chance of being promoted, which they didn't have in the American army, because the American army was still white Anglo-Saxon Protestants running it. And they didn't, if you were a Catholic Irishman, you were just going to stay right down. So John Riley and the boys, they all change sides. And they go to war, and they are the San Patricios, and they are like the leading light of the Mexican army during that war, which went on for something like 18 months, I think. And they fought in 9 battles, and the only problem was that the Mexicans lost all 9 battles because they were just simply outnumbered. I mean, the Americans sent everything they had down. This is a painting from the time, but they basically just had far superior manpower and firepower and pushed them back again and again. the Battle of Churubusco was a particularly unfortunate one for the San Patricios, when a fella called Santiago O'Leary is standing next to a cannon which a stray run, and the San Patricios who stay and fight are then captured, and over the next 2 weeks the 71 names I showed you earlier were all executed, bizarrely with the exception of John Riley, now known as Juan Riley, who, I won't go into it here, but he managed to get away and died of the drink a few years later, the poor fella. So that is a sort of, oh yeah, that was the concluding scene. Sorry, the last grim episode, ladies, but the 71 people who were executed, there was one final battle in this war at a place called Chapultepec. And unfortunately, at the pivotal moment in the battle, this wicked, another Irishman called Harney, who was in the US Army, he wheeled out 30 of the San Patricios onto a gallows and hung them all at once, just overlooking the battlefield. And the Mexicans said, "We surrender." And they gave up. And the United States, thereafter, having just got Texas, also won all of this. Colorado, New Mexico, Arizona, Utah, Nevada, California. Nice win. So, that is where we begin. I'll now veer you off in a little different direction. Does anybody know what this is? This is the Stone of Divisions, which is on the hill of Ushna in County Westmeath. And when I was doing this story and thinking about maps in the world and where people go, I started looking into maps and things. And this one's always fascinated me, because this is, in all the ancient Irish legends, this is taken as the central point of Ireland, the navel of Ireland in all the legends. And even Ptolemy, in one of his maps, I'm sure they have it upstairs, again, observes it as the navel of Ireland. And what just is amazing about it is when you look at a map of Ireland, guess where it is? So how do they work that out? I mean, I don't know whether it's exact, but isn't it amazing that they were actually, that's pretty much the middle of Ireland. And they managed to stick this rock here and know that that was the centre of Ireland 2,000-3,000 years ago. Anyway, it just made me think about maps. You probably can't see this at all. Can you see that at the back? It's a very hazy map. This is from 1539. And the point here is that people are starting to get a hang on how the world looks. Even in 1539, you can see very little India. Australia doesn't exist, but Africa's taking shape, and they're starting to get a hang on what South America and North America looks like. So awareness of the world beyond us is starting to grow on the Waterford side of the border. And he was one of the most extraordinary men of the Elizabethan age. He was a Renaissance man, a mathematician, a linguist, and just a brilliant sort of astronomer, all that stuff. He was also great mates with Sir Walter Raleigh. He was his accountant and ended up becoming his best friend and his advisor. And Sir Walter Raleigh at that stage had just been given 42,000 acres of Ireland by Queen Elizabeth, which he kind of won when he defeated the Earl of Desmond, for those who remember that period, the Desmond Rebellions. And he was a terrible old cutthroat, old Raleigh. He really was. Swine. But anyway, he was also praised in London. And he obviously sponsored or did all those missions across the Atlantic. And on one of these missions, he came back and brought back two lusty savages, as they're described in the annals, called Manchesi and Wantoa. Manchesi and Wantoa. I'm going to make up their names anyway. I can never quite remember their names. We'll call them Manchesi and Wantoa. And Thomas Harriot here was absolutely fascinated by them, and he went down and he sat down with them. They came from this island called Wingandaco, and he sat down with them and talked about things, learnt their language to such an extent that he found out that Wingandaco actually means you have nice clothes. And he decided to go back to America with them. And he went, and himself and another fellow called John White, who lived in Newtown in County Waterford. This is the 1580s we're talking. They both headed back to North America and spent the winter in Chesapeake Bay, wintering with the Indians. John White sketched a party they had at the time, which I thought was very jolly, with all these people running around with lollipops. And then I started looking at these things. They looked very like heads on sticks, but I think they're just carved. And they actually had a very tremendous time there. They were very successful, very happy, passed a happy few months there. which Thomas Harriot later wrote about in a book called A Brief But True Report of My Time in Virginia. And he wrote that book in Milano Abbey. But, oh yes, that was the thing. Obviously, the tobacco thing. During that time when they were over there, they were introduced to opawak and, wikadaba, I'll just call it wikadaba, which were in fact tobacco and potatoes. And it was Mr. Harriot and Mr. White who returned from their trip and brought back the tobacco, handed it in to Sir Walter Raleigh. Raleigh hadn't been allowed go on this trip because Queenie wanted him sitting on her knee. And so they gave it to him. He then took it on and claimed the credit for it, or latterly takes the blame for introducing tobacco and potatoes. That's what Milano Abbey looks like nowadays down in Waterford. It's falling apart. If anybody knows anybody who could do anything to stop it falling apart, it would be great, because as well as everything else, the School of Night used to meet there. I don't know if you've ever heard of this lot, but this is this very atheistic group of Elizabethans that included, well, obviously Thomas Harriot and Raleigh, but also Shakespeare and Christopher Marlowe and all these, including a Bunbury, in fact, who were all on the fringes of this strange world. And they used to occasionally meet there, by all accounts. So we have our growing links. This is a map by Halley, Edmund Halley, whose eyesight was so good that he was able to see a comet 5.2 million miles away. And this is from 1701, which is the same date that this library was founded, in fact. But you can see now that the links starting to happen. And down here to the Caribbean, where I've got to introduce a bit of Totty into the talk. This is Rihanna, who is, I was just looking up some statistics about her, and she has her YouTube downloads have now surpassed 3 billion. So, and she's obviously a hugely phenomenally successful singer in the modern age, and this is her looking at her more presentable and a nice Irish dress. So the reason I have her here is because her ancestry is also Irish. And way back in 1636, the first boatload of Irish convicts was dispatched from Cork down to the Caribbean. And you still get that accent. You know, I was watching a documentary with Rita Marley being interviewed about life with Bob Marley. And there was a period when they were going to move to England, and you see her being interviewed, and she said, "Sometime Bob said to me he want to move to London." I say, "What do you want to move there for, like?" And I'm like, it's like, jeepers, couldn't believe it. But you know, the connections are definitely there. So you have that first load in 1636, but again, in the time of Oliver Cromwell, some 50,000 people were rounded up in the 1650s, most of them Irish, and they were taken to Bristol, sold as slaves, then stamped with the name of the ship that they were going to sail on, and taken out to Barbados to work on the sugar plantations. And their skin obviously burnt in the sun, and they became known as the Barbados Redlegs. And their descendants are still there. And Rihanna is, as I say, her family of the Fentys of Barbados, who claim Irish ancestry all the way back, although she does not have red legs in any way. She's got very beautiful legs. Yeah. Such beautiful legs that she won the Celebrity Legs of a Goddess Award in 2007. And frequently tops polls with their lovely legs. This man, I don't know what his legs look like. They may have been lovely. He is John Barry, who is considered the father of the American Navy. And he was born in 1745 in Wexford, in a place that I'm going to mispronounce. Tecumseh? Does anybody know Wexford? It's near Ladies Island down there. He was born there and skedaddled to the States when he was a young fella, worked his way up from cabin boy to becoming one of the I suppose, the main players in the US Navy during the War of Independence, and ultimately became the commander-in-chief of the US Navy, and is, as I say, heartily hailed over in the States for that, and also in Tecumseh in County Wexford. He is sometimes confused with this man, William Brown from Foxford in County Mayo, who became Guillermo Brown and went to Argentina. He did exactly the same thing. He joined the Navy as a young fella, went to the States, joined the Navy as a young fella, and then went to Argentina and basically founded the Argentinian Navy, or the Argentine Navy. And he is so celebrated over there that they have this so many squares, battleships, football clubs, schools, all named after him. And again, he's also celebrated in Foxford, County Mayo. So suddenly you've got two Irish lads. One runs the Navy up there, one runs the Navy down there. Nice one. And we're also obviously making a bit of an impact in the US itself. This is a wax relief of a fellow called James Hoban, who was born in Castle Cuff in County Kilkenny, if any of you know that part. And when he was a young fella, he went out to South Carolina. He was an architect. He'd actually trained as an architect in Ireland and was involved in two houses, Desert Court, which is in County Kilkenny, which was destroyed in the Troubles, and Westport House, which some of you may know in County Mayo. And he'd taken those skills and he headed over to South Carolina and became an architect there, was involved in the construction of a lot of buildings in Charleston and places. And then a Carlow-born senator, Piers Butler, said, "You should meet my mate George Washington, because George wants a new house built." And James Hoban duly built the White House. So that was a big job for a Kilkenny man. It was subsequently burnt down by another Irishman in 1812 from County Down, I think the other fellow was. But Hoban was still alive, so he got called back and do it again. And he did. So here's a hat trick of we always make a big song and dance about the American presidents and their Irish connections, but certainly in the mid-19th century, the influence was enormous. This fella, Andrew Jackson, was the 7th president of the United States, and his parents came from Carrickfergus in County Antrim and emigrated there, I think, a year before he was born. He was born in Tennessee, and he was pretty hardcore. He had very little time for the Red Injuns and very little time for, who was? Oh, he was very pro-slavery. So there's one of our early heroes. And James Knox Polk, who I mentioned earlier, he's the guy who kick-started the Mexican War in 1845. He was president during the whole time of the Irish famine, left office in March 1849, died of cholera 3 months later, aged 53. So he was one of the youngest. He's considered one of the best presidents the US had. This is the 15th president, James Buchanan, whose father was from Ramelton in County Donegal. And he has the distinction of being, he looks a bit like Darragh O'Brien, I think, doesn't he? He was the only bachelor to ever have been in the White House. Unfortunately, the place you're most likely to find him on is a list of the top 5 worst ever US presidents. I don't know enough about why he's the president, considered such a bad president, except that the US Civil War started straight after he left office. And if your country goes into civil war just after you leave office, then you've obviously done something slightly wrong. This is a photograph of Fort Sumter, where the first action of the American Civil War took place. I mentioned earlier that something of the region of 50% of the British Army were Irishmen by the 1840s. By the 1850s, something like 50% of the US Army were Irish, which is astonishing. But Damien Shields has just brought out a new book called The Irish in the American Civil War. There were 1.6 million Irish people living in America when the war broke out in 1861. And Fort Sumter is where the first action took place in the war, and the soldiers who were based here were answerable to Lincoln, but they were in Charleston. They were surrounded by what would become the enemy. The enemy started shelling the fort, and so the fort eventually surrendered. Now, there were 86 soldiers in the fort at that time, and 38 of them were born in Ireland. So it's certainly quite an Irish affair. Furthermore, as they were lowering the flag and walking out, they were all told, you can leave with, we're not going to kill you or arrest you, you can go home. One soldier was trying to do something with his gun, and a bit like poor old Santiago O'Leary, who we talked about earlier, his gun blew up, he was killed, and the spark hit the gunpowder, and another 5 guys were very badly wounded. One of them died. What is interesting is the guy who was taken as the first casualty of the US Civil War, who was doing that maneuver, was Daniel Hoch from Tipperary. And of the other 5 guys, one was from New York, the others were from Tyrone, Limerick, Waterford, and Cork. The guy from Cork died, became the second casualty of the US Civil War. So our it is something which Damien Shields addresses a lot in this new book, which if you're interested in this, have a look at it. It's just very interesting. It's this sort of, he calls it a sort of forgotten war, which Ireland doesn't really know very much about. But hundreds of, thousands, possibly more than 100,000 Irish were involved in it. Many of them died, of course. So that's enough war stories, ladies. We'll move on to Elvis, the Elvis of the title. Where I live in County Carlow, I have a view over a thing called Eagle Hill, and it's the sort of foothills of the Wicklow Mountains. And Eagle Hill is out in front of our house. We look out at it. And at the top of that hill is a crucifix, which lights up at night in a glowing orange. And I, of course, think of Jesus Christ when I see that, because that's what you're meant to do. But I also think of Elvis. And the reason I think of Elvis is because in 1775, William Presley was his name, had a little farm on the side of the hill there. And in 1775, William Presley was beaten up feloniously, riotously, and routously is the description of how he was beaten up by a local gang. And he decided he was fed up with that. Himself and his brother Andrew emigrated from Hackettstown, County Carlow, to New Orleans, and then made their way up to Tennessee. And that is his great-great-grandson. So that's why I think of Elvis, and my daughter does too now, so that's great. So staying with that, I'm slightly biased because my father is from Carlow and my mother's from Kilkenny, so a few of these characters you're going to see now have that sort of a connection. Walt Disney, the other guy in the title, his grandfather was born near Goran in County Kilkenny, and they're actually the Disney family they were Normans, and the original spelling is D''Isgny. They were Normans who came over from Calvados with William the Conqueror, settled in England, but by the 17th century had moved to Ireland and were based in around a place called Clonmelsh in County Carlow, to which this man came in the 1930s or 1940s to pay his respects. But the Disney connection was to Ireland was quite strong. There's a guy called Roy Disney, who is his nephew and who's one of the controlling players in the Disney company, who just died 2 or 3 years ago, and he had a house down in West Cork where he spent a lot of time. So strong links. Then the old gorgeous George, ladies. Oop, where's he gone? George Clooney's great-grandfather, Nicholas Clooney, another Kilkenny man, worked as a stonemason in the Ormond Slate Quarries, which is near Tullaroan or Windgap, if anybody knows that part of Kilkenny. And he and his brother emigrated in, I think, 1851 to Kentucky. And the Irish connection in that family is obviously continues also through his aunt, Rosemary Clooney, Mambo Italiano. So a few showbiz links. It goes early days, if anybody knows Fordstown near Navan in County Meath. These three brothers, who are kind of unsung heroes, or famous people, I suppose, rather than heroes, Owen, Matt, and see, there you go, that's how famous they are. Owen, Matt, and three brothers, all called the Moors. Owen, Matt, and can't remember. They were born in County Meath, crossed the seas in the 1890s, settled in Kansas, and then the older two brothers ran away, joined the circus, and eventually fetched up in California, where they became part of the very early days of the silent movie scene, which was kicking off just before the First World War. And they were so successful in their day that all three of them have stars on the Hollywood Walk of Fame. And the guy who you see playing the piano there is Owen Moore. He actually married Mary Pickford, who was unbelievable how popular and well-known Mary Pickford was in the 1910s, 1920s. She was every bit as famous as Princess Di or anybody like that is today. Everybody knew her all over the world. Her grandfather was from Tralee. Obviously, we know the Grace Kelly story, beautiful Grace. And her grandfather emigrated from Mayo, probably from Newport in County Mayo. But what I thought was quite interesting, I've got to know Newport quite well, and with the Vanishing Ireland book, I've ended up interviewing quite a lot of the oarsmen, the guys who had taken their currachs out to Achill Island or down to the Aran Islands, carrying turf and all that. Big, strong men, powerful rowing muscles on them. And her grandfather was known as Strong Jack Kelly. And you get the impression he might have actually rowed across the Atlantic. But when they settled in Philadelphia, in the next generation, her father continued the rowing tradition to such an extent that he won 3 gold medals at the Olympics for the US in rowing. And so too did his first cousin, who was also from Mayo and had moved and settled in America. So this one family racked up 6 gold medals in rowing. So there's a bit of a, there's something going on between the Currachs and the gold medals there, I'd say. Mr. Gregory Peck, born in 1916, about 3 weeks before the Easter Rising. And what's interesting about him is his grandmother was from Dingle. She was an Ashe from Dingle, and they were close cousins of Thomas Ashe, who commanded the Irish Volunteers during the Easter Rising in 1916 up in Ashbourne in County Meath, and was subsequently captured and tried alongside Eamon de Valera, ended up going on hunger strike for a while, was released, then went back on hunger strike and died in 1917. So in Gregory Peck's childhood, there was a very strong link going on there between what had happened in Ireland during the whole War of Independence and his own family. Now, I'm aware this probably comes across as just a bit of a trotting out all the people with Irish-American links, but what I suppose I'm trying to get at is that in some instances it really has had a profound influence on our country when people go away, because they retain their links, as we all know in this year of the gathering, that they have retained their links, and sometimes they've been extremely useful for Ireland. Like this man, does anybody know who that is?
Ford.
Henry Ford, exactly. And so his family had emigrated from Ballinascarthy in County Cork in the 1830s, the first lot, and they cleared a pine plantation around Detroit in Michigan, got the farm up and running, and then whistled for the rest of them to come over. And Henry Ford's grandparents and his great-grandmother and his father, who was only a little fellow at that stage, all headed over and settled in Detroit. They left in 1847. His grandmother actually died on the journey across in 1847. But they retained their very strong links with Cork to such an extent that when Ford had made his millions and invented the working week, as well as everything else, he set up his first production plant outside of the States was in Cork, which is where I think they built the Pope Mobile as well. They built the first ever Pope Mobile. Maybe it's the same one that the Pope Francis will be driving around in. Here you'll see Vanity Fair, special issue, guest edited by Bono, but he's not the only Irishman on the cover. We have Muhammad Ali, from Abe O'Grady of Ennis, County Clare, great-grandfather. And of course we're probably all quite familiar with Barack Obama's connections to Fulmouth Carn